The hand holding the ticket was steady. That was the first thing worth noting, not the dust on her boots, not the weight of the single bag hanging from her shoulder, not the way the late afternoon light turned the hills the color of old copper. The hand was steady, and the woman it belonged to had learned somewhere between the life she had left and the long road that had brought her here, that steady hands were the only currency she had left that no one could take away from her. Wren Calloway stood at the edge of a dirt road and looked at the name written on the ticket. Iris Calloway. Her sister's name in her sister's careful handwriting on a piece of paper that had been meant to carry a different woman to a different life. She looked at it for only a moment long enough to confirm what she already knew, short enough to avoid the particular weight that came with looking at things too long. Then she folded it once, folded it again, and pressed it into the pocket of her coat. The paper made a small sound against the lining, quiet and final, like a secret choosing where to live. Ahead of her, past a gate built from timber and iron-broken spur ranch, stretched out against the late sky. It was not what she had imagined. She wasn't sure if she was honest, what she had imagined something smaller. Perhaps something that looked more provisional, more like a temporary arrangement. A place a person could pass through. This did not look like something a person passed through. The main house sat solid and low against the hillside, its log walls darkened by years of weather, its windows catching the last angle of afternoon light and holding it. The barn to the east was larger than the house itself, which told her something about the man who had built this place, what he valued, what he trusted, where he put his faith. The fence lines ran straight and far in both directions, disappearing into the grass long before she could find their ends. The wagon that had brought her this far was already gone. She had not heard it leave. She had been looking at the ranch, and somewhere in that looking the sound of hooves and wheels had faded, and the road behind her had gone quiet. She did not turn to check. There was nothing behind her worth turning for. The gate was unlocked. She pushed it open, heard the hinges speak in that low and weathered voice that old iron has after years of cold winters and dry summers, and walked through. She had crossed perhaps half the distance to the front porch when the door opened. He did not come out onto the porch. He simply appeared in the doorway and stood there. And the doorway seemed like the right size for him, not cramped, but close. He was tall in the way of men who have never thought about being tall broad, through the shoulders, in the way of men who have used their bodies as instruments of work for so long that the body has simply become the work. His hair was dark, threaded through at the temples with silver that had nothing apologetic about it. His face was the kind of face that had probably been simply handsome once in the way of young men who don't know it yet, and had then been worked on by time and weather and whatever it was he carried behind his eyes until it had become something more considered, more true. He looked past her, over her shoulder down the road she had come from at the settling dust where the wagon had been. "Anyone else coming?" he said. 3 words. Not unfriendly, she registered that, but not warm either. The voice of a man who had learned to ask only what needed asking, and expected the same precision in return. Wren did not look back at the empty road. "Just me," she said. He looked at her then. Not the way some men looked at women who arrived unexpectedly, not with suspicion, wearing the costume of welcome, not with anything she needed to guard against. He looked at her the way a careful man looks at a column of numbers that doesn't resolve the way he expected. Thorough, unhurried, setting something aside in his mind to be returned to when he had more information. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come in then." The inside of the house was clean in a way that spoke of intention rather than habit. The kind of order that one person maintains not because it comes naturally, but because disorder is something they have decided deliberately and some time ago not to allow. The furniture was plain and well constructed. A fireplace built from river stone dominated the north wall, its proportions correct for the size of the room and for the winters that came down off those hills. There were no curtains on the windows, and she understood at once that this was not an oversight. The views through each window were worth keeping clear. Hills to the west, catching the last of the sun. Open grazing land rolling south toward a tree line she couldn't quite reach with her eyes. The kind of country that made a person feel two things simultaneously very small and very free. A table sat at the center of the main room. On it, a single sheet of paper set squarely in the middle as though it had been placed there with some care. He picked it up and set it in front of her without preamble or explanation. It was a list. She could see the format before she'd read a word of it, the clean left margin in the line spacing, nothing wasted. She read it from the top. Accounts ledger maintained weekly. Supply inventory taken monthly. Correspondence handled as needed. Meals practical, no elaboration required. The house. The vegetable garden in season. When he was out on the range, which the list implied, would be often she would be the only one in the main house. She turned the paper over and looked at the back. Nothing there. She set it down. "All right," she said. Something shifted in him, small and quickly contained, but she caught it. He had expected a question. Most people, she supposed, would have asked one. Several, probably. She hadn't, and the absence of it had landed somewhere in his attention. "Colt Whitaker," he said. "Wren Calloway." Her own name out before she'd considered it. Not Iris. Wren. The name she had carried through everything, through the accusations and the departure and the long road. And now this gate with its iron hinges. It was still hers. Still true. It meant nothing in this valley, and that was precisely why she said it. He nodded the way a man nods when he's confirmed something and stored it. Room at the end of the hall. Door locks from the inside, keys already there. He lifted his hat from the hook near the door. "Supper's your concern. Provisions are in the kitchen." Then he was gone out the door, which closed behind him with the quiet authority of a man who did not linger in rooms once he had finished with them. Wren stood in the center of his house and let herself breathe. The room at the end of the hall was small and clean and had a window that faced east. She understood immediately what that meant: morning light, which was the only light worth waking up to in her experience. The bed was narrow and covered with a quilt that had been washed so many times its colors had softened into something gentler than they'd started as. There was a wooden chair, a chest of drawers with empty drawers, a braided rug on the plank floor. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. But the window glass was clean, and the lock on the door worked smoothly when she tested it, and when she set her bag down beside the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, she found the mattress was sound. She sat there for a moment and looked at her hands. They were not remarkable hands. Not soft, they had never been soft, not since she was old enough to work. The knuckle of her right index finger bore a small scar from a letter opener years ago, before she'd learned to be careful with the small, sharp tools of her trade. She had spent years with these hands, moving across ledger pages, tracing rows of figures, finding the places where things did not add up. She had done it well. She had done it honestly. And she had discovered at a cost she was still calculating that doing something well and doing it honestly were not always protection enough. She stood up. unpacked what little she had, hung her spare dress on the hook behind the door, and put her few other things into the chest of drawers and closed each drawer carefully. Then she went to find the kitchen. The pantry was better stocked than she'd expected. She stood before it the way she stood before any new set of information, taking inventory before drawing conclusions. Flour, salt, lard, dried beans, cornmeal, a crock of salt pork coffee. The basics of a working kitchen, nothing more. She found her way around the space, methodically locating the skillets and pots, the basin and the water pump, the wood box beside the stove. Then she set to work, and the familiar rhythm of it, the measuring, the sequencing, the small decisions that accumulated into a meal, did something helpful to the tight place that had been living in her chest for longer than she wanted to account for. Colt came in when the light outside had turned fully golden. He went to the basin first and washed his hands. She noticed that he did not have to be asked or reminded, that it was simply part of his sequence, the way a man washes his hands who has always washed his hands before sitting at a table. He sat down. She set a plate in front of him, beans and salt pork, and a pan of cornbread honest food, without pretension, and sat across from him with her own plate. He ate without looking up. She ate without offering conversation. The quiet between them was not comfortable in the way that quiet between people who know each other is comfortable. It was something less than that, and also something different, not hostile, not weighted with things unsaid. It was simply the silence of two people who had not yet determined what the other one was and had enough sense not to decide prematurely. When he'd finished, he pushed his plate back slightly, not away, just back, the gesture of a man who has finished and is acknowledging it, and looked at the surface of the table rather than at her. "You said you read accounts." "Yes." "Keep them too." "That's what accounts are for." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a ledger in the top drawer of the desk in the far room. Goes back 3 seasons. I'd want you to start there and tell me what you find." He stood, carried his plate to the basin, and rinsed it himself without being asked. "Thank you for supper," he said, and went back outside. Wren sat alone at the table. The lamp on the sideboard made a warm circle in the growing dark. She listened to his footsteps cross the porch and go down the steps and move away toward the barn. And then she cleared her own plate and went to find the ledger. It was where he had said top drawer right side, a book with a worn cloth cover and pages that had been handled enough to know their way to laying flat. She brought it to the table and opened it under the lamplight and began to read. She was a careful reader. She had trained herself to be, because the thing about numbers was that they looked objective, looked certain, looked like the one kind of language that could not be bent, and that was exactly why they were so useful to people who wanted to bend things. The lie lived in the logic, not in the figures themselves. She had to read slowly and look for the places where the reasoning did not quite hold, where the sequence had a joint that moved a little too freely, where the variance always broke in the same direction. The house settled around her as she worked. The fire in the main room ticked and cooled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in that low, continuous voice she was beginning to recognize as the sound this particular piece of land made when it breathed. She did not hear any of it consciously. She was reading. She read the first season's accounts, then the second. The lamp burned lower, and she moved it closer and kept reading. By the time she reached the 3rd season, the house had gone fully quiet, and the night outside the windows had settled into the deep, still dark of open country, and she had found it. It was small, That was the craft of it, small enough that a busy man would walk right past it, repeated often enough across enough transactions that it accumulated into something real. The supply purchases. The figures matched the receipts closely enough not to alarm. But the discrepancies were there, and they were consistent, and they always moved in the same direction. Always away from Broken Spur, never toward it. A few extra cents here. A slightly higher figure there. The kind of variance that looked like rounding error looked like the honest imprecision of working from memory, looked like nothing until she laid 3 years of nothing side by side and added it up. Wren did the arithmetic on a scrap of paper she found in the desk drawer. She did it twice to be certain. Then she set the pen down and looked at what she had written. The number was not small anymore. She sat with her hands flat on the closed cover of the ledger and thought about what she was holding. 3 seasons of careful, patient theft from a man who had built this place with his own hands and who she was already certain had known something was wrong and had not been able to prove it. She had seen that kind of knowing before in the set of a jaw, in the way a person double-checked things they couldn't explain their doubt about, in the particular tiredness of someone who suspects they are being diminished, but cannot point to the wound. She did not go to find him. It was late, and she had been in this house for less than a day, and she had learned at a price she was still paying what happened when you brought people difficult information before you had earned the standing to bring it. When the messenger has no established credibility, the message gets buried under questions about the messenger. She would not make that mistake again. She put the ledger back in the drawer exactly as she had found it. In the small room at the end of the hall, she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of a ranch settling into night, the distant low of cattle, the occasional movement from the barn, the wind working its way through the grass beyond the fence lines. Sounds she did not know yet, but was beginning to learn. Her mind ran the numbers again, without her permission, the way a mind does when it has found something it doesn't yet know how to put down. She thought about the man who had asked, without asking, if she could stay. She thought about the name in her pocket that was not her name. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere as the wrong woman and find that the work waiting there was exactly right. The window faced east. She watched the darkness begin, almost imperceptibly, to change that slow transition from black to the particular blue that comes before dawn, the color the sky makes when it is remembering the sun. She was still watching when she heard him in the kitchen. Careful sounds a man who had learned over years of solitary mornings how not to disturb a house that was mostly empty. The soft weight of a kettle being set down. The low, patient work of building a fire. She rose, dressed, and went out. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Not startled, she was coming to understand that he was not a man who startled, but registering the change in his space with the attentiveness of someone who notices things and does not perform not noticing. He set a cup of coffee on the table before she had crossed the room without being asked. She sat down and wrapped both hands around it and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I need to tell you something," she said, "before I've been here long enough for it to be complicated." He sat across from her. He did not say go ahead or lean forward or make any of the small social gestures that people use to signal that they are listening. He simply became still in a way that meant the same thing, and waited. She told him about Iris. The essential facts plainly stated. Her sister had received his letters and agreed to come. Then 5 days before she was supposed to leave, she had changed her mind, a different opportunity. a different direction delivered with the breezy confidence of someone who had never had to live with the consequences of her own inconstancy. She had left the ticket on the table. Wren had looked at it for 5 minutes, then picked it up, packed her bag, and walked to the station. She watched his face while she said all of this. The quality of his stillness did not shift. Whatever was happening behind his eyes was happening in a place he had long practice keeping private. When she finished, he looked at his coffee cup. The pause stretched long enough that a less composed person might have started to fill it. Wren waited. "You read accounts?" he said. "Yes." "And there was nowhere else you needed to be." It wasn't quite a question. "Something like that," she said. He was quiet again. Then he stood, picked up his cup, and moved toward the door. He stopped at the door frame with his hand resting on the wood. "The ledger," he said without turning. "You were up late with it." She had not heard him check on the house. She hadn't thought he had. "Yes," she said. "And I'd like one more day with it before I say anything." He turned just enough to look at her over his shoulder. Something moved in his expression, not warmth in any simple sense of the word, but the conditions that warmth requires. The soil before anything grows. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held it back, and then he nodded once and went outside. Wren sat alone in his kitchen with the coffee cooling between her palms and the east window beginning to fill with the first honest light of morning. The hills outside were going from shadow to gold ridge by ridge, the way good things usually came, not all at once, but steadily if a person was patient enough to watch for them. She did not feel safe. She had learned not to reach for that word too quickly. But she felt something in the neighborhood of it, some easing of a tension she had carried so long she had stopped knowing it was there until it began very slightly to loosen. She set down the cup. She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress and went to find the ledger, and she sat down with it in the growing light, and she picked up her pen, and she began. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. That at least was something she understood. Outside the gate swung open, and the sound of it carried clearly in the still morning air, and Colt Whitaker began his day the way he had apparently begun every day for 20 years, alone with his hands, asking nothing from anyone, needing nothing from anyone in a life he had constructed specifically so that nothing and no one could be taken from him. He had not counted on the woman now sitting at his table with a ledger open in front of her and a pen in her steady hand. He had not counted on her at all. The second morning was easier than the first, which was not what Wren had expected. She had expected the strangeness to compound the way it usually did in unfamiliar places, each hour adding its weight to the one before until the accumulated foreignness of everything became its own kind of exhaustion. Instead, she woke to the east light coming through the window the way she had already learned it would, and she lay still for a moment and listened to the ranch finding its morning, and something in the quality of the air told her where she was before her mind had fully arrived. That had never happened to her in any of the other places she had tried to make work. Usually, she woke already braced. She dressed and went to the kitchen. The fire was already built and the coffee already on, and she understood that this was simply how mornings worked here in this house for this man, not a gesture directed at her, not a signal of anything, just the unvarying sequence of a person who had organized his life around the reliable. She poured a cup and stood at the east window and watched the hills come into color, and did not feel the need to fill the quiet with anything at all. She had the ledger open on the desk before he came back in from the barn. What she was doing was not dramatic by any outward measure. It was the slow, methodical work of someone who had spent years learning to read between the lines of a set of figures, running her finger down each column, making small marks in the margin of her own notepad, cross-referencing dates against seasons, against the receipts she'd found tucked inside the back cover like an afterthought. But by mid-morning, she had built something from those unremarkable pieces that was no longer unremarkable at all. A pattern, clean and consistent and patient, the way only deliberate things are patient. Whoever had been doing this had been doing it carefully and for a long time, and had been counting on the fact that the person on the other end of the ledger was too busy or too trusting or too uncertain of his own ability to read the numbers to look closely enough. She thought about that for a moment, the specific cruelty of exploiting a man's relationship with his own limitations. She had seen that kind of exploitation before. She knew its shape intimately. She was still at the desk when Colt came to the doorway of the far room, glanced at the spread of papers before her, and said nothing, waiting. She had decided sometime in the night how she would do this. Not with apology, not with softening. Not with the elaborate cushioning that people sometimes used when they were afraid of the reaction to what they were about to say. He did not seem like a man who needed cushioning. He seemed like a man who needed facts delivered in the order that they mattered. She turned the notepad so he could read it. 3 seasons, she said. The same supplier every time. The amounts are small, individually small enough to look like variance. Added together, they represent a meaningful loss to this ranch. She had written the total at the bottom and underlined it once. She did not watch his face as he read it. She looked at the ledger instead, giving him the privacy of his first reaction. The quiet lasted longer than she had expected. I knew something was off, he said finally. His voice had not changed in any way she could measure. Couldn't prove it. You'd started trying. She opened the ledger to the page where she'd found the figures and set it beside his own notepad, the one she had found, and replaced in the desk drawer that first night, the one covered in his careful, unpracticed handwriting. The numbers he'd worked out by hand in the small hours of some earlier season, trying to locate a discrepancy he could feel but couldn't name. You were looking in the right place. You just didn't have the full sequence in front of you. He looked at his own page for a moment, then at her. How long did this take you? Most of yesterday evening, some of this morning. He picked up the notepad and looked at her total again. What do I do with this? That depends on what you want out of it. You can confront him directly. You have enough to make him uncomfortable, probably enough to end the arrangement cleanly. But the first thing to do, regardless, is find a different supplier. He set the notepad down. He looked out the window for a moment at the fence line to the south. Then he looked back at her, and she saw something in his face that she recognized, not gratitude exactly, which was a complicated thing, and sometimes a condescending one. It was something simpler, the expression of a person who has been carrying a weight they couldn't place, and has just had someone walk up and name it for them. All right, he said. That was all. He picked up both documents and went back toward the main room, and she heard the desk drawer open and close. She stayed where she was for a moment, looking at the open ledger. Then she closed it and went to see about the noon meal. On the third day, she found the error in the fence records, a different kind of error from the ledger, not malicious, but simply wrong, the result of a measurement taken in haste and never corrected, which meant that the section of fence along the north pasture that Colt believed was within his property, boundaries might not be. She mentioned it to him in passing. The way she had learned was the right way to bring him information directly without preamble. At a moment when he was already in motion, rather than at rest, because a man in motion could absorb news better than a man sitting still who felt he was being delivered something. He stopped walking. He looked at her. He asked one question: how certain was she? Certain enough to check, she told him. Not certain enough to act on yet. He nodded and kept walking. But that afternoon, she saw him out in the north pasture, with a measuring line moving along the fence in the long slant of afternoon light, and she understood that this was also how he was, that he did not wait to be told twice, and did not wait for someone else to verify what needed verifying. He went and looked for himself. That evening, for the first time, they sat at the table after supper and talked for longer than the meal required. It was not conversation in any elaborate sense. He asked her how she had learned accounts. She told him dryly, without self-pity, that she had taught herself from a set of books belonging to an employer who had a well-stocked library and a habit of never noticing what his staff was reading. He asked what kind of establishment. She said an import business large enough to be complicated. He asked if she had liked the work. She considered the question more seriously than he had probably expected her to. I liked the problems, she said. I liked the moment when something that looked like noise resolved into a pattern. The actual keeping of records was... She paused, searching for the word that was true rather than merely diplomatic. Tedious, but the finding was not. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as one of his specific forms of expression. "You're describing hunting," he said. She had not thought of it that way. "I suppose I am." Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the grass with that low, continuous sound that was nothing like wind in a city, thicker somehow, more patient, as though the land itself was breathing. "I tracked a missing herd once for 11 days, he said. Everyone said, 'Give it up.' They were gone. The numbers didn't work, wrong direction, wrong timing for where they should have drifted. I kept at it." He looked at his hands on the table. "Found them." "Where?" "Box Canyon, 3 ridges east. Someone else's brand on 2 of them by then." A pause. "I got them back." She believed him entirely. She did not ask for the details of how. They sat a while longer in the lamplight, not talking, not needing to. And then he banked the fire and said goodnight and went down the hall, and Wren sat alone for a few minutes with her cooling coffee and thought about a man who could track something for 11 days on the evidence of numbers that didn't add up, and thought about how that was not so different from what she had been doing her whole working life, and felt cautiously, provisionally, that she was not quite as foreign here as she had expected to be. On the 5th day, Hadley Cross came to call. Wren was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she came to the doorway to see a woman of some 60-odd years riding in with the ease of someone who had been on horseback since before she could read. She dismounted at the post without hurrying, tied her horse with the practiced economy of long habit, and came up the porch steps with a tin in her hands and no particular expression on her face that indicated she felt she needed a reason to be here. "You must be the one who came," she said, looking at Wren with eyes that were direct and unhurried, the color of creek water over slate. "Hadley Cross. I'm not a neighbor. I'm too far for that. But I've known this ranch longer than Colt has, so I come when I want to." Wren stepped back to let her in. "Wren Calloway." "I know." Hadley set the tin on the table, dried apple cake wrapped in a cloth. "I heard a woman had come. News travels the way news does." She settled into a chair at the table with the comfort of someone who had sat in it before, and looked at Wren with an attention that was frank without being rude. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Something softer, maybe." The letters Colt received were, she paused and something moved through her expression. "Delicate, that's the word for it." Wren said nothing. She went to pour coffee. She was aware of being looked at, not uncomfortably, not the way some people looked at you to find a flaw or confirm a suspicion, but the way this woman looked at everything, apparently, which was to say, directly and without apology. It was a quality Wren associated with people who had long since stopped caring what others thought of their frankness and had discovered that most people respected it anyway. "The letters were written by my sister," she said, setting the cups down. "I came in her place." Hadley received this information without visible surprise. "And Colt knows this." "I told him the second morning." Hadley picked up her cup. She looked out the window toward the north pasture, where the figure of Colt was just visible in the middle distance, moving along the fence line with the measuring cord. "He didn't send you away," she said. "No." "Interesting." Hadley drank her coffee. She said it the way a person says a word when they mean it to do real work, not as a filler, not as a social sound, but as a genuine conclusion. Then she set her cup down and looked at Wren again. "He's a solitary man. Not unfriendly, don't mistake it for that. He just never found much use for company. Especially not since—" She stopped. Wren did not push. Hadley looked at her with what felt like approval. "You don't pry." "Not until I've earned it," Wren said. A small smile moved across the older woman's face, brief and real, and the most unguarded thing Wren had seen in this valley yet. "Good," she said simply, and reached for a piece of the apple cake. They sat for a while, the two of them, in the clean afternoon light of the kitchen, and talked about practical things, the rhythms of the seasons out here, the way the weather came down off the hills, in a pattern worth learning the nearest settlement, and what it could reliably provide, and what it couldn't. Hadley spoke without condescension, as someone sharing useful information with a person she expected to be capable of using it. Wren listened the way she listened to ledgers, completely, without interrupting, noting what would need to be returned to. When Hadley rose to leave, she paused at the door. "He took you out on the range," she said. It wasn't a question. "The second day," Wren said. Hadley nodded slowly, the way a person nods when something confirms what they thought they already knew. "He hasn't done that," she said, "with anyone." She put her hat on. "Not once. In all the years I've known him." She rode out, and Wren stood on the porch and watched her go, and held that information carefully, the way she held things that she suspected were more significant than they appeared. That evening, she mentioned to Colt, without making anything of it, that the fence measurement issue along the north line was likely to affect the boundary markers on the eastern side as well, and that it might be worth pulling the original survey documents before he addressed it formally. He looked at her for a moment, in a way she was coming to recognize that particular look of someone filing information about a person rather than about the thing the person had just said, and then he said he'd see to it, and that was the end of that. But the next morning, there was a second cup of coffee set out before she came from her room. Not placed in the center, placed on the side where she sat. She did not remark on it. She sat down and wrapped her hands around it and looked out the window at the hills, and something quiet and careful moved through her chest, and she let it and did not try to name it too precisely. She was making a list of items the kitchen was low on when she heard the horse. Not Hadley this time. The gait was different, and there was something in the approach that was less familiar with the road. She went to the window. A man she recognized rode in at a pace that was not quite leisurely, too deliberate for that too purposeful. He wore a coat that had been expensive once. He stopped at the gate and looked at the house, and then he looked at the woman in the window, and for one moment across that distance, their eyes met. Wren did not move, did not step back from the glass. She knew him. He had been at the edges of everything that had gone wrong for her, not the center, not the architect of it, but the kind of man who made himself useful to the people who were, a witness who could be relied upon to see what he was told to see. She watched his gaze sharpen, then be deliberately flattened into something casual, the performance of not recognizing. Colt came around from the side of the barn at the sound of the arrival. The man on horseback smiled broad-practiced and asked something about the road to the next settlement. Colt answered. A brief exchange, nothing remarkable. The man thanked him, nodded once in the direction of the house without quite looking at the window again, and rode on. Wren stepped back from the glass. Colt came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "You know him," he said. Not a question. "From before," she said. "From the place I came from." "Is he a problem?" She thought about the careful way the man had not looked at the window a second time, the way he had asked about the road with just the right amount of disinterest. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. Colt looked at her for a long moment. She could not read the full of what was moving behind his eyes, but she could read the edges of it, the decision being made, the conclusion being reached in that quiet interior place where he apparently resolved most things before they surfaced. "All right," he said. He went to the hook and took his coat. "I'm going out to the east line. I'll be back by dark." He paused at the door. "If he comes back, don't answer it." He was gone before she could respond. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of his horse leaving the yard, and then she stood there a while longer in the quiet of the house, thinking about a man who had just told her in the plainest possible language that whatever she was something he intended to be on the same side of. That night, she did not sleep easily. She lay in the east-facing room and listened to the country at night, and let her mind run through what it needed to run through. The man on the horse had been sent to find her, or had found her by accident, and would now report the finding. Either way, the outcome was the same. The past she had ridden a long road to put distance between herself and was not keeping its distance. She thought about the ledger in the drawer and the fence line in the north pasture, and what Hadley had said he had never taken anyone out to the range, not once in all the years she had known him. She thought about what it cost a man like that to change a habit. She thought about what it might mean that he had. She thought, too, about the difference between the life she had been living and the life she was perhaps beginning to live instead. The difference was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with fanfare or revelation. It was more like the difference between holding your breath and releasing it, something that happens in the body before it happens in the mind, something you only notice when it has already been going on for a while. She had been holding her breath for a very long time. She could feel in the quality of this particular dark something beginning to shift. What she had come here to escape was real. What had been done to her was real. The injustice of it was real and would remain real regardless of what happened next. But she was beginning to understand that the injustice did not have to be the most important thing about her. That a person could carry a wound without being defined entirely by it. That the story she had been telling herself, The story in which she was the woman something had been done to permanently and irrevocably was not the only story available. There were other stories. There was this one, for instance, a woman who had picked up a ticket and gotten on a train and arrived somewhere that turned out against all reasonable expectation to need exactly what she knew how to do. That was also true. Both things could be true at once. She had spent so long in the company of the first story that she had forgotten the second one was available to her. She was remembering it now slowly, the way a person remembers something they knew long ago, and set down somewhere, and then couldn't locate, not with a sudden rush of recognition, but with the gradual accumulation of evidence, until the fact of it became undeniable. She was still thinking when the darkness began to change at the window, shifting from black to deep blue. And then the hills outside began to show their ridgelines. And then it was morning again. And there was the sound of a kettle in the kitchen, careful and quiet, the sounds of a man who had lived alone long enough to move through a house without disturbing it, though lately there had been someone to disturb, and he had not stopped being careful. She got up and dressed and went out. He looked up from the stove. He did not ask if she had slept. He did not ask what she was thinking about. He set a cup of coffee on her side of the table and went back to what he was doing. And she sat down and put her hands around the warmth of it and looked at the east window, which was beginning to fill with light, the color of something that had not yet decided what it was going to be. "I'll need to tell you more," she said, "about where I came from, about why he knows me." He did not turn around. "When you're ready." "I'm not sure I'll feel ready. I'm not sure that's how it works." A pause, the small sounds of the kitchen. Then, "No," he said in a tone that suggested he knew something about that particular difficulty from the inside. "It usually isn't." She nodded, though he wasn't looking at her. Outside, the first birds were beginning in the grass, and the hills were coming into their morning colors, and Broken Spur Ranch was waking up around them the way it woke up every morning, steady, unhurried, asking nothing dramatic of anyone. Wren sat at the table where she had been given a place with work she knew how to do, waiting for her in the next room, and a man at the stove who had not flinched at a single thing she had told him. Not yet safe, but the nearest thing she had found in a very long time. And for now, that was a number worth working with. The calf came early, the way trouble often did in the middle of the night, without warning, in weather that had turned mean by sundown. Wren heard Colt moving through the house before she was fully awake, heard the particular quality of his footsteps that was different from the careful quiet of his usual mornings, faster, purposeful, in the way that purpose looks when something is wrong. She was dressed and at the kitchen doorway before he'd finished pulling on his coat. He looked at her. He did not tell her to stay inside. "The young heifer," he said. "She's early." Wren took her own coat from the hook and followed him out. The barn was warm in the way that barns are warm when they are full of living things, not the clean warmth of a fire, but something thicker, more animal, the accumulated heat of large bodies in a closed space. Colt had the lantern going, and in its light, the scene was immediately clear. The heifer was down in the far stall sides, heaving with an effort that was not producing what it needed to produce. One of the ranch's two hands, a quiet older man who slept in the bunkhouse, was already there, his face set with the particular expression of someone who knew enough to know this was bad and not quite enough to know what to do about it. Colt went in. Wren came behind him and held the lantern where he needed it without being asked, adjusting the angle as he moved, keeping the light steady on the work. This was something she had discovered about herself in the days since arriving, that she had a capacity for steadiness in the middle of difficulty that she had never had much occasion to test before, and that it was apparently reliable. The work was slow and demanding, and required everything Colt knew, which was considerable. Wren did not try to help beyond what she was asked to do. She held the light. She handed him what he needed when he said the word. She stayed quiet because she understood that the quality of the air in that barn was something he needed to be able to hear through the animals' breathing, the small sounds that told him how close or far they were from the outcome he was working toward. It took the better part of 2 hours. When it was over, when the calf was on the ground and breathing unsteady and improbable and alive, Colt sat back on his heels in the straw and was still for a moment. Not with relief exactly. With the particular quality of stillness that follows sustained effort when the body has used everything it had and pauses before deciding what to do next. Wren set the lantern down on the stall rail and sat on an upturned crate nearby. She did not say anything congratulatory. She just sat in the warm dark of the barn while the calf figured out its legs, and the heifer turned her head to investigate this new thing she had made, and the lantern light moved in a small draft from somewhere. After a while, Colt said without looking up from the calf, "You didn't go back inside." "No." "Most people would have." "I wasn't tired." He looked at her then across the stall, and something in his face was different from any expression she had seen on it before. Not open exactly, he was not a man who when open she was coming to understand. But less fortified than usual, the particular look of someone who has been in difficulty with another person and come out the other side and is now seeing that person with the eyes of that shared experience, rather than the eyes of first impression. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. He looked back at the calf. They stayed in the barn until the sky outside began to lighten, neither of them apparently finding a good reason to leave. The lantern burned low. At some point, Colt leaned his back against the stall boards and stretched his legs out in the straw and closed his eyes for a few minutes, and Wren looked at him in the dim light and thought that this was probably the most unguarded she had seen him, not asleep, not quite, but in that border country between exhaustion and rest where the ordinary efforts of self-containment become temporarily too expensive to maintain. She looked at him for a long moment before looking away. This was something she rarely permitted herself, the simple act of looking at a person without any instrumental purpose, without calculating what the looking might mean or what it might reveal about herself. She looked at the lines of his face in the lantern light, which was the most honest light. There was incapable of flattery, showing everything as it actually was, the weathering around his eyes, the set of his mouth, which was stern in repose but not unkind, the mouth of a man who had decided something about himself a long time ago and had been keeping that decision ever since. She thought about what it would take to get a man like that to unmake a decision. She thought about what it would look like if he did. She looked away before he opened his eyes. When the first real light came through the barn door, he stood, checked the calf once more, and said, without turning, "I'll make breakfast." It was the first time he had said that. Every morning prior it had been her concern without discussion. She followed him back to the house. The conversation that mattered, the real one, the one that would change the specific weight of the air between them, did not happen at breakfast. It happened that night when the day had gone long and the supper things had been cleared and the lamp on the table was burning at its evening level, and neither of them had found a reason to get up yet. It seemed to begin in the middle, the way honest conversation sometimes did not with a prepared opening, but with someone saying a true thing into a space that had grown receptive enough to hold it. He said, "You had work before. Good work by the sound of it. Something went wrong." It wasn't phrased as a question. She had noticed he did this, stated the edge of what he wanted to know, and left it open so that she could choose her own way in rather than feeling interrogated. She looked at the lamp. I worked accounts for a man who ran a large operation, import and distribution, complex enough that the books required real attention. She paused. I gave them real attention, more than he had planned on. You found something. I found several things. The clearest one was a pattern of payments to companies that didn't exist, well constructed on paper, but hollow. Money moving from one side of the ledger to the other and coming out somewhere it shouldn't. She turned her cup in her hands. I documented it. Everything I could verify. Took me the better part of 4 months working at night after the regular work was done, because I needed to be certain before I said anything to anyone. And then you said something. I went to the man directly above my employer in the hierarchy of the business. Someone I believed was outside the arrangement. Someone with the standing to act on it. A pause. The lamplight. The sound of the wind outside finding the eaves. He was not outside the arrangement. Colt was quiet. Within a week, she said, I was the one who had done something wrong. The documentation I had assembled became evidence that I had been accessing records I had no authorization to access. The pattern I had identified became in the telling of it a fiction I had invented to conceal my own misconduct. She said this without heat, without the tremor she had sometimes heard in her own voice in the early days after it happened, when the injustice of it was still something she was surprised by. She was not surprised by it anymore. The people who had worked beside me for years found it easier to believe the version of events they were told than the version I was offering. I understood it. I didn't like it. Colt looked at his hands on the table. Large hands marked by work, a long scar along the left thumb from something she hadn't asked about. He looked at them the way he looked at things he was thinking hard about. And the man on horseback, he said. The one who came through. One of theirs. A man who was reliable in certain ways when reliability was required. She looked at the lamp again. When he came through here and recognized me, he was either looking for me or he found me by accident and will now report it. Either way, the outcome is the same. Outside, the wind had decided on something and was moving with more intention now. The grass bending in long waves she could imagine without seeing. Colt said, I should have told you something. She looked at him. The reason the ledger was in the state it was, he said, the reason I hadn't dealt with it properly. It wasn't only that I couldn't prove it. He was looking at his hands. I taught myself to read later than most. By the time I was making this ranch work, the shame of it was established. And shame makes a man avoid the things that remind him of it. He turned one hand over. I could read enough. I read the figures well enough to know something was wrong. But sitting with books, working through long columns, needing to go slowly, I avoided it when I could avoid it. And whoever set this up knew I would. The quality of his voice had not changed. He said it the way he said everything flat clean without self-pity. But she understood what it cost. She understood the specific arithmetic of it, the years of building something magnificent with his hands, alongside the private weight of the one thing that had never come as naturally, the one thing that could be used against him. You taught yourself, she said, eventually. That's not a small thing. He looked up at her. It's not a large one either. Yes, she said quietly. It is. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away out the dark window, and she let him have the privacy of that. "The man I bought most of my supplies from for 3 years," he said. "I chose him because he was direct, seemed like a man who didn't complicate things. Turns out the simplicity was the complication." He paused. "I don't enjoy being made a fool of." "You weren't made a fool of. You were a capable man with one area of difficulty, and someone with patience found it and used it. That's not foolishness. That's what happens when a particular kind of dishonesty meets a particular kind of trust." She turned her cup again. "I spent 4 months proving something that got turned against me. I'm familiar with the feeling." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. He did not smile easily, and she had stopped expecting it. Something quieter than that. The expression of recognition, of one person seeing in the experience of another the specific shape of something they know from the inside. "That the truth needs company," she said, answering the question he hadn't fully asked. "It needs documentation, and it needs witnesses, and it needs to be placed in front of people who have the standing and the will to act on it. By itself, it's lighter than it should be." He considered that. "And now you have the documentation. I have 3 seasons of ledger work and a pattern that holds up under examination." She looked at him. "And you have standing in this valley." Another quiet moment. But this one was different in quality from the ones before. Something had shifted in the room, in the air between them, in the specific weight of what they were to each other. She could feel it without being able to say precisely what had changed. He said, "The supplies. I've already changed the arrangement." "I know. I updated the records." He almost smiled. She was nearly certain of it. It was Iris who arrived 3 days later without warning on a horse that suggested she had made arrangements she did not intend to be questioned about. Wren saw her from the kitchen window and felt the particular internal adjustment of someone who has built something carefully and can now see the thing that will complicate it. Iris Calloway was lovely in the way that some people are lovely easily naturally, in a way that had probably never cost her any particular effort, and so had never given her reason to develop the other resources that might have substituted for it. She came up the porch steps with the confidence of someone who expected a welcome, and when Wren opened the door, her face did the complicated thing that Wren recognized: genuine gladness and genuine guilt, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision she understood to be imperfect and had been carrying that understanding without quite knowing what to do with it. She embraced Wren in the doorway. "I'm so sorry," she said, which was probably true, and was probably not the whole of what needed saying between them, but was a real beginning. Wren stepped back and let her inside. Colt came in from the back of the house and stopped when he saw the visitor. His eyes moved from Iris to Wren, a brief reading of the room, the practiced observation of a man who had learned to take in a scene quickly and accurately. Wren said, "My sister, Iris." And then, "Iris, this is Colt Whitaker." Iris turned on him the full effect of the smile she had been deploying her whole life without much conscious thought. "I've heard nothing about you," she said, which was the kind of charming admission that charming people made, which I'm told means I've been missing something. Colt looked at her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything: thorough, unhurried, completely unmoved by the effect that most people fell to. Then he said, "I'll leave you to it," and went back the way he'd come. Iris watched him go. Then she looked at Wren with an expression that was new in Wren's experience of her sister's face, something genuinely surprised and genuinely curious. And underneath both of those things, something that might have been the earliest stage of understanding. He didn't look at me, Iris said. No. He looked at you. Wren moved toward the kitchen. Sit down. I'll make coffee. They sat across from each other at the table where Wren had sat every morning with the east light and the coffee that appeared before she asked for it, and she looked at her sister and felt the collision of her present and her past happening in real time quietly, without visible drama, the way most important collisions actually happened. Iris wrapped her hands around her cup and said, "Tell me it's all right. That you're all right." "I'm working," Wren said. "I'm doing work I know how to do in a place that needs it done." "That's not what I asked." Wren looked at her. "It's the most honest answer I can give you right now." Iris received that with more grace than Wren had expected. She looked around the kitchen at the ledger on the desk in the far room, visible through the open door, at the herbs drying in the window, at the small details that accumulate when a person begins to inhabit a space rather than merely occupy it. "You've made yourself useful," she said. And it was not patronizing. It came from a place of genuine recognition, however late arriving. "I've made myself necessary," Wren said. "It's different." The most significant moment came after supper when Iris found her way out to the porch and Wren followed her, and they stood in the dark, looking at the stars over the hills, more stars than either of them had grown up with, the kind of sky that only existed at a certain distance from everything. Iris said quietly, "He put your cup on a different side of the table from his own. Did you notice that?" "Yes. Before you came out this morning, I was watching." Wren said nothing. "I got 3 letters from him," Iris said. "Long letters, careful. He described this place in a way that made it sound like something worth coming to. I thought," she paused, "I thought it would make a good story. I didn't think it would make a good life." She turned to look at her sister. "I don't think that about many things. It turns out you do." This was as close as Iris had ever come in Wren's experience to saying something fully true about the difference between them. Wren let it sit without answering because it did not require an answer. It only required to be heard. The sound of the door behind them, Colt checking that the latch on the far side of the porch was secure, a thing she had seen him do every night. He did not look at either of them. He pulled the latch, found it sound, and turned to go back in. Then he stopped. "Night's cold," he said to no one in particular, and went inside, and a minute later he came back out with 2 wool blankets and set them on the rail beside the sisters without comment, and went back in again. Iris picked up one of the blankets and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Wren. "He did that," she said, "without being asked. He does most things without being asked." Iris wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills with the expression of someone doing an honest accounting of themselves and not entirely pleased with the result. "Then, what happened to you?" she said. "Back there, before you got on the train." She said it carefully, not as the opener of a conversation she felt entitled to, but as the admission of something she was ashamed not to have asked sooner. "I should have asked a long time ago. I didn't, and I've been trying to understand why I didn't, and the most honest answer I can arrive at is that I was afraid that if I asked and actually listened to the answer, I would have to sit with the fact that I had not been paying sufficient attention to my own sister, that I had been living my own life without looking closely at yours." She paused. "That's an uncomfortable thing to discover about yourself." Wren looked at her. "It's also an honest one," Yes. Iris pulled the blanket tighter. I'm trying to be more honest. I'm not sure I'm very good at it yet. She looked at Wren. But I'd like to hear it now, if you're willing to tell me. Wren looked at the stars for a moment. Then she told her. Not the version she had learned to make shorter and less damaging sounding for people who needed it simplified. The full version. What she had found, and what she had done, with what she had found, and what had happened after that. Iris listened without interrupting. By the end, her hands on the porch rail were tight. I didn't know, she said. I didn't tell you. You should have. Perhaps. Wren looked at the hills. But I've spent a long time learning the difference between the people who can be told something and the people who need to be sheltered from it. I wasn't sure then which you were. A long quiet. And now, Wren looked at her sister. I think you're more capable of hard truths than you've had occasion to prove. Something crossed Iris's face, the particular expression of a woman being offered more credit than she feels certain she has earned, and deciding perhaps for the first time to hold herself to it rather than deflect it. Inside the house, the lamp on the table burned steadily. Outside, the hills held their shapes against the stars. Broken Spur Ranch settled into its nighttime sounds around them, the distant cattle, the barn, the wind moving through the grass in that low, continuous voice that was nothing like any sound Wren had known before she came here, and was now, she realized, a sound she would miss if it stopped. She was not ready to call it home. She was a careful woman, and careful women did not call things by names they were not yet certain of. But she was beginning to understand that the not yet certain and the no were not the same thing. That there was a space between them where something could be growing. The door opened again. Colt leaned out far enough to say, "There's coffee." And then he went back in, and neither of them moved immediately. But eventually, they both went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp made its warm circle on the table, and the four walls of the house held the night at the distance it was supposed to be held. Wren sat down at her side of the table. Across from her, Iris sat. Between them, 2 cups of coffee already poured. And somewhere behind them in the house, the sound of a man who had decided without announcing it to stay up a little later than usual, as though the particular combination of people currently under his roof was one he was not quite ready to end the evening on. Wren wrapped her hands around the warmth of her cup. She looked at the east window, which held nothing but darkness now, but would in a few hours begin the slow work of letting the light back in. She thought about numbers that resolved into patterns, about things that were hard to prove but worth proving, about the difference between being in a place and belonging to one. She thought about a man who brought blankets without being asked and did not know or pretended not to know what that said about him. She thought she would let him pretend a little longer. It seemed under the circumstances like the generous thing to do. Iris meant well. Wren had always known this about her sister, that the harm Iris caused moved through the world wearing the face of good intention, which made it no less harmful but considerably harder to be angry about. The road to every difficult thing Iris had ever set in motion was paved with genuine care, genuine concern, genuine love expressed in ways that had not quite accounted for the full weight of their consequences. She told Colt about the accusation on a quiet afternoon while Wren was in the north pasture, checking the fence markers they had restaked the week before. Wren did not know this had happened until she came back to the house and found the specific quality of air waiting for her. Not the comfortable quiet she had grown used to, the settled peace of a house that had arranged itself around two people who had learned each other's rhythms, but something different, tighter. The particular atmosphere of a room that had recently held difficult words and had not yet released them. Colt was at the desk in the far room. He did not look up when she came to the doorway, and the not looking up was different from his usual quality of attention directed elsewhere. It was deliberate. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, in the particular stillness of a man holding himself in place. She waited. He said, "Your sister told me something this afternoon." "All right." He looked up then. His face was the careful, composed face she had come to know, but underneath the composure was something she had not seen there before. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger, and in some ways harder to look at. The expression of a man working very hard to remain fair in the presence of information that made fairness expensive. "She said there was an accusation made against you before you came here, that you took something that didn't belong to you." The words landed the way words land when they are both expected, and still somehow a shock when the thing you have been bracing for finally arrives and turns out to be as heavy as you feared. "Yes," Wren said, "that accusation was made. She said it was why you had to leave. It was one of the reasons." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is it true?" She held his gaze. "No." Another stretch of quiet. The kind that asked more of both of them than any conversation they had yet had. "I believe you," he said. He said it quietly, and he said it as though he meant it, and she understood from the way he said it that he was not finished. "But I also—" He stopped, looked at the desk, looked back at her. "I don't know what I don't know. That's the thing. I thought I knew the full of it before this afternoon, and then something new came in, and I realized the shape of what I knew was smaller than I'd thought." "Iris told you what she knows," Wren said, "which is partial. Not because she was dishonest with you, because what she knows is partial. There are pieces of this she doesn't have because I didn't give them to her." "Why not?" "Because I was protecting her from the harder parts of it, which I've come to understand was its own kind of error." He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill it because she had learned that with this man, the space between words was not absence. It was where he did his most important thinking, and interrupting it was a kind of discourtesy. Finally he said, "I need some time with this." Those words, careful, measured entirely without cruelty, were somehow the most difficult thing he had said to her since she arrived. Not because they were unkind, because they were honest, and the honesty of them contained a distance she had not felt from him in weeks, and she had not understood until this moment how much she had come to depend on the absence of that distance. "Of course," she said. She went to her room. She did not pack her bag. She stood at the east window and looked at the hills in the late afternoon light and thought with the same precision she brought to columns of figures about what was true and what was not, and what she had and what she might lose, and what the cost of various decisions would look like laid out in honest sequence. She did not sleep that night. Iris came to her room door after supper, knocked softly, came in when invited. She sat on the wooden chair with her hands in her lap and looked at her sister with the face of a person who has understood too late the weight of what they've set in motion. "I thought he knew," she said. "I assumed you'd told him the full of it. I wanted him to understand what you'd been through. I thought if he knew, he would—" She stopped. "I made it worse." "You didn't make it worse out of meanness," Wren said. "Does that help?" Wren looked at her. A little. Not entirely. Iris looked at her hands. What will you do? I don't know yet. I'm thinking. If you have to leave. I'm not going to leave, Wren said. She said it before she had fully decided it, and the sound of it in the room confirmed it in the way that saying true things sometimes did. I'm not going to leave because I ran from the last place. I'm not doing that again. Iris looked at her with the expression she had worn on the porch 2 nights ago, the one that said she was being offered a version of her sister she had underestimated and was trying to hold herself to the responsibility of seeing it accurately. Tell me what to do, Iris said. Whatever it is, tell me and I'll do it. Wren looked at the window. Go to sleep. There's nothing to do tonight. In the morning, Colt was not at breakfast. His horse was gone from the barn. There was no note. He was not a man who left notes easily because notes required a certain ease with written language that he was still building, and she respected that he had not forced himself to it. But the fire had been built before he left, and the coffee was on, and her cup was on her side of the table. She sat with the coffee and looked at it, and understood that the cup meant something. That a man who needed time and the open country to think in had still in the sequence of tasks he'd completed before riding out set her cup where her cup went. It was not a declaration, but it was not nothing either. It was evidence, and she was a woman who knew how to read evidence. She had read 3 seasons of ledger entries and extracted from them a truth that a man had been working to conceal. She could read 1 cup of coffee set on one side of one table and understand what it was telling her. It was telling her that whatever he was working through out there on the open range, he had not stopped thinking about her. It was telling her that his habits had reorganized themselves around her presence without him perhaps having fully acknowledged that reorganization. It was telling her that a man who built his life on the premise of needing nothing had somewhere in the week since she arrived begun to need something, and that the something was specific and present and sitting at his table drinking coffee in the morning light. She did not allow herself to feel too much about this. Not yet. She was a careful woman, and careful women verified before they concluded. But she noted it. She filed it in the part of her mind that held things worth returning to, and she went back to work. She worked. There was always work, and she had found that work was the best container for the kind of thinking that needed to happen below the surface of things, that when her hands were occupied with something useful, the deeper parts of her mind ran cleaner and arrived at clearer conclusions. She went back to the ledger. Not because there was new work to do in it, she had brought it fully current, but because she had been turning over an idea for several days, and she wanted to test it against the actual numbers one more time before she did anything with it. The pattern she had documented over 3 seasons was not on its own recoverable. The money was gone, and she had no mechanism to compel its return. But what she had was proof. Clean documented, verifiable proof of a practice that if it had been applied to Broken Spur, had almost certainly been applied to others. Other ranches, other operations run by people who were busy and trusting, and perhaps like Colt had a specific relationship with the written record that made them easier to exploit. She thought about what she had said to Colt in the lamplight weeks ago. The truth needs company. Needs documentation and witnesses and people with the standing and the will to act on it. She had the documentation. The standing in this valley did not belong to her, but she knew someone it belonged to. She closed the ledger and went to find Hadley Cross. The ride out to Hadley's place took the better part of an hour across country she had come to know well enough to read the ridge that marked the boundary of the north pasture. The dry creek bed, that would run again in spring, the stand of cottonwood that meant water underground even when the surface was dust. She had learned this landscape the way she learned ledgers, slowly, methodically, until the logic of it became readable. Hadley was in her garden when Wren arrived. She looked up without surprise, as though she had been expecting the visit, if not the precise timing of it. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a bench beside the garden wall. "Tell me what's happened." Wren told her. Everything the accusation, Iris's well-intentioned disclosure, Colt's need for time, and then the thing she had come to propose. She laid it out the way she laid out figures, in order without embellishment, with the conclusion at the end where conclusions belonged. Hadley listened without interrupting. She had that quality, which Wren had come to value, as one of the rarest forms of respect, the capacity to hear a thing all the way through before responding to it. There were people who listened in order to respond, and people who listened in order to understand, and the two were very different experiences from the inside. Hadley was the second kind. She listened the way the valley listened steadily, taking in everything, revealing nothing until she was ready. When Wren finished, the older woman was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. Her hands were at rest in her lap, and Wren noticed them, the hands of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, capable and unhurried, the hands of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that most things worth having required more time and effort than people expected. There was something in those hands that Wren found reassuring. They were honest hands. They told the truth about who they belonged to. "The supplier," she said. "You believe others have been treated the same way." "I think it's probable. The method was too practiced to be new." "And if others found the same pattern in their own records, then it becomes something different from one woman's word against an established man's character. It becomes a pattern with multiple witnesses. The kind of thing that can't be dismissed by attacking the person who noticed it first." Hadley looked at her. In the clear outdoor light, her face was very readable, not soft, not hard, but honest. The face of a woman who had lived long enough to see the difference between things worth fighting for and things that only looked like it. "You'd be asking me to go to people I've known for years," Hadley said, "and ask them to look at their books and to do it on the word of a woman who arrived here a few weeks ago under a name that wasn't fully her own." "Yes," Wren said. "That's what I'm asking." A long pause. "Why should I?" "Because you've already decided I'm worth trusting. You decided it the first time you came to the ranch. I saw it in your face." Wren met her gaze. "And because what I'm describing is real, and the proof is real, and if it happened to Colt Whitaker, it happened to people you care about, and you have the standing in this valley to make something true become something useful." Hadley looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at her garden. "I'll need to see the documentation." "I brought it." Another pause. And then Hadley Cross almost smiled the same brief, real expression Wren had seen in the kitchen of the main house weeks ago, the one that meant genuine approval from a woman who did not distribute approval casually. "All right," she said. "Show me." It was late afternoon when Wren rode back to Broken Spur. Colt's horse was back in the barn. She brushed down her own horse and went to the house and found him at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular, with the face of a man who has been thinking for a long time and has arrived somewhere. She sat across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I went to Hadley Cross," she said. He looked at her. I showed her the documentation. The full pattern, 3 seasons, every discrepancy in sequence. She set her hands flat on the table. She's going to speak to 6 families in this valley. Ask them to look at their own records from the same period with the same supplier. If the pattern holds, and I believe it will, then what happened to this ranch becomes part of something larger, something that has witnesses, something that can't be solved by making it about me. He was quiet for a long moment. You did that today? Yes. While you were thinking, she said, I was working. It's what I do. Something moved across his face. She watched it happen, the specific sequence of a man in the process of understanding something that reorganized other things. He looked at the table. He looked at the cold coffee. He looked at her. I owe you an accounting, he said. She waited. I've been alone a long time, he said. Long enough that the habits of it are deep. I don't take things on faith easily. I built everything I have on the premise that the only reliable thing was what I could verify with my own hands, my own eyes, my own work, and that served me. A pause. It's also made me. He stopped, looked for the word. Slow. To trust. Slow to let anything in that I can't fully account for. She said nothing. He was getting somewhere, and she had learned not to interrupt the path. When Iris told me what she told me, the first thing that happened before anything else was that I believed you. That was my first response. Before the doubt came in, before the questions, I believed you. He looked up at her. And then I spent the rest of the day asking myself why that troubled me. Why it was easier to sit with the questions than to sit with the thing I actually knew. The light through the window had gone the color of the hour before evening, not golden, not gray, but something between the color of the sky when it is deciding what kind of night to be. I've lost things, he said, before this ranch. Things I let matter to me before I understood the cost of it. I built this place in a way that I told myself wouldn't let that happen again. He stopped himself. Not in a way that wouldn't let it happen. In a way that I told myself wouldn't. Those are different. Wren looked at him across the table. This man who had ridden out into the open country to think and come back and was now sitting here saying the most honest thing she had heard him say in the quietest possible voice, because this was how he said the things that cost him the most. You're not. He paused, looked at his hands. You're not what I arranged for. You're not what the letters described. You're not what anyone expected, including me. He looked up. But you're what's here, and what's here has turned out to be. He stopped again, and this time the stopping was different, not searching for words, sitting with the weight of what he was about to say. Then, very quietly, more than I knew to want. The room was very still. The last of the afternoon light lay flat and warm across the table between them. Wren looked at this man, this solitary, careful, unexpectedly deep man who had built his life on the premise of needing nothing, and was sitting across from her, having ridden out and come back, and said the most difficult thing available to him, and she felt something in her chest do the thing she had been carefully not naming for weeks now. She said, I went to Hadley because I needed to do something useful while you were gone. That's true. But it's also true that I went because, she paused, let herself have the pause fully before continuing. Because this is a place I've been allowed to be myself. The self I actually am not the one built by other people's accounts of me, and I don't intend to let that be taken without a fight. He looked at her. Not by the man who set the original trap, she said, Not by whatever he sends here, and not by doubt either. She held his gaze. Yours or mine? The quiet that followed was not the quiet of unresolved things. It was the quiet of two people who had said what needed saying, and were now sitting in the space that saying it had made larger than it had been before, and calmer in the good way. Then from the back of the house, the sound of Iris attempting something with the stove that produced a muffled sound of minor frustration, which broke the gravity of the moment in the way that only small domestic sounds can. Colt's expression did the thing that was not quite a smile. Wren felt it in herself too, the release of tension that was not quite laughter but was related to it. The specific lightness that comes when something that has been very serious finds at its edges the possibility of being bearable. He stood. He picked up his cold coffee, looked at it, and set it back down. He went to the stove to make fresh. He did not ask if she wanted a cup. He simply took two down from the shelf. She watched him move around the kitchen, the man who had ridden out into the country and come back, who had said more true things in the last half hour than she suspected he had said in the last several years, who was now making coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided what he was doing and was simply doing it. He set a cup on her side of the table. He sat back down across from her. Outside, the sky had made its decision, and the first stars were beginning to assert themselves above the western hills. Tentative at first, the way stars were at the beginning of the night, and then steadier, and then simply there, reliable as anything. Wren wrapped her hands around the warmth of the cup and thought about Hadley Cross riding out soon to families who would open their ledgers and look at 3 seasons of figures and find she was almost certain the same pattern she had found. She thought about truth needing company and what it looked like when company finally arrived. She thought about a man who had ridden out and come back. That was not a small thing. Hadley Cross was a woman who understood that the most effective kind of power was the kind that did not announce itself. She did not ride out to the 6 families with any urgency in her manner or any drama in her presentation. She went the way she went everywhere at her own pace, on her own terms, with the particular authority of a woman who had been a fixture of this valley for long enough that her presence at a door meant something before she had said a single word. She brought no copies of Wren's documentation with her. She simply asked each family over coffee or at a gate or across a fence line whether they might take an evening to look back at their supply records from the past 3 seasons, whether they had used a certain supplier, whether the figures, when examined closely, held up the way figures were supposed to hold up. She did not tell them what they would find. She let them find it. The first family sent word back within 2 days. Then the second. By the end of the week, 4 of the 6 had confirmed what Wren had already known. The pattern was not unique to Broken Spur. It was consistent, and it was old, and it had been running quietly underneath the surface of commerce in this valley for long enough to have become, in some unspoken way, simply part of the landscape. The kind of thing that people felt obscurely in the gap between what they expected and what they received, but could not locate precisely enough to name. Now it had a name. Now it had multiple sets of records to give that name weight. Wren did not go with Hadley on any of these visits. She stayed at the ranch and worked and waited, which was one of the harder disciplines she had mastered in the past years. The ability to set something in motion and then trust it to move without her constant intervention. She had learned that lesson the hard way in the place before this one, where she had pushed too hard and too visibly, and had made herself the story instead of the truth she was trying to tell. She would not make that mistake again. Colt watched her during this time with the quality of attention she had come to know as his particular form of care, not hovering, not asking unnecessary questions, simply present in the way that a solid thing is present, there if she needed it, not demanding to be used. On the 8th morning after her visit to Hadley, 2 men arrived at the gate of Broken Spur Ranch. Wren saw them from the kitchen window. She recognized the one in front, the man who had passed through weeks ago, who had looked at her through the glass with the eyes of someone taking note of a location. Beside him rode a man she had not seen before, heavy-set, wearing the expression of a person accustomed to being the largest presence in whatever room he occupied. She went to the back door and said quietly, "Colt." He came to the window, looked, said nothing for a moment. Then he went to the hook and took his coat. She followed him to the porch. The 2 men stopped their horses at the gate. The larger man spoke first. He said there were matters relating to a former employee that required clarification. He said that the simplest resolution would be for the relevant party to accompany them back for a conversation. He looked at Wren when he said, "relevant party." He did not say her name. Colt stood at the top of the porch steps. He was not a tall man in the theatrical sense, not the kind of tall that announced itself. He was the kind of tall that you noticed only after you had been looking at him for a while and realized that you had been arranging your own posture differently without knowing why. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. The large man's expression shifted slightly, the adjustment of someone recalibrating the difficulty of a situation. "Sir, this isn't a matter concerning you. If the lady would simply—" "She's not going anywhere with you," Colt said again. Exactly the same words, exactly the same tone. No emphasis added, no heat. The kind of repetition that is more authoritative than any escalation could be, because it communicated that the first saying had been the final saying, and everything after it was the other party's choice to make. Wren stepped forward past Colt to the top of the porch steps. She had decided somewhere in the 8 days of waiting and working and thinking that she was finished with the particular posture of a woman bracing for a blow. She was finished standing slightly sideways to things that were coming at her directly. She was going to stand and face it. She looked at the man who had seen her through the window. She spoke without raising her voice, and without hurry, the way she had learned to speak when she needed what she was saying to land and stay landed. "The records your employer sent you here about, they were my own. My own notebooks assembled over 4 months of careful work. What he calls theft, a fairer account would call recovery of what was mine." She held the man's gaze steadily. "And there are at present 6 families in this valley who have examined their own records and found the same pattern of irregularity I found in this ranch's ledger, 6 families who now understand what was done to them and have the paperwork to say so. Whatever calculation your employer made before sending you here, the arithmetic has changed." The 2 men looked at each other. The particular exchange of 2 people doing sums that are not resolving in their favor. The large man looked at Colt, possibly in search of a different kind of conversation. Colt looked back at him with the expression of a man with nothing to add, because the woman beside him had already said the necessary things. The first man gathered his reins. "We'll be in touch," he said, which was the thing men said when they needed to retreat without appearing to retreat. "You know where to find us," Colt said. They rode out. Wren stood at the top of the porch steps and watched them go. The dust settled. The road went quiet. Behind her, she heard Colt come to stand beside her, and they stood together in the still morning air, and watched the direction in which trouble had departed until the sound of hoofbeats had fully dissolved into the ambient sound of the country. "They won't come back," she said. Not with certainty she had learned not to mistake hope for certainty, but with reasonable confidence, the kind grounded in an honest reading of the available information. "No," Colt said. "I don't think they will." She let herself believe him. Iris left the following morning. She came to find Wren after breakfast while Colt was in the barn, and they sat together on the porch in the early light, the way they had sat on the first night sisters, which was a complicated thing to be with a history between them that was also complicated, and a morning that was clear and honest and new. Iris said, "You should have told me, years ago, about what was happening to you." "I know," Wren said. "I should have." "I would have." Iris started and then stopped, and the stopping was the most honest thing she could have done, because they both understood that neither of them knew exactly what Iris would have done, and acknowledging that uncertainty was truer than filling it with reassurances. "You might have helped," Wren said, "or it might have made things more complicated. I don't know. What I know is that I made the decision not to tell you, and I made it for reasons that made sense to me at the time, and some of those reasons were about protecting you, and some of them were about protecting myself from having to be seen in difficulty by someone who knew me well. Both of those things were true at once." Iris looked at her. The morning light was doing what morning light does, making things look clean and possible the way they always looked before the day had fully arrived with its complications. "You're very clear," she said, "about things, about how they actually are." "I've had to be," Wren said. Iris was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's in love with you." Wren looked at her hands. "I know you know that," Iris said. "I'm saying it because I think sometimes you need things said out loud before you let yourself fully account for them." Wren thought about this, about whether it was true, and about the difference between knowing something and letting it settle into the part of yourself that makes decisions. "I'm still learning to trust what's in front of me," she said. "I was taught for a while not to." "I know." Iris looked out at the hills. "But you're here, and what's here is real." She turned to look at her sister fully. "You're the most real person in it." They sat together for a while longer in the particular way that sisters sit when they have said enough and don't need to say more. And then Iris stood and embraced her. Not the breezy surface embrace of a rival, but the slower, more deliberate embrace of someone trying to put something genuine into an action, and went to collect her things. Colt came up from the barn as Iris was loading her horse. He held the animal steady at the post while she finished. He said something quiet to her that Wren, watching from the porch, could not hear. Iris looked at him for a moment, then nodded once with the expression of someone receiving information they can use. Then she mounted up, lifted a hand to Wren, and rode out through the gate. Wren watched her go until the road was empty again. Colt came back to the porch. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the place where the road curved away between the hills, which was the particular view that Wren had been looking at in various lights, and at various hours since the day she arrived, and which had become, without her, quite noticing the moment of transition, simply the view from home. "What did you say to her?" she asked. "That she has a good sister," he said, "and that she should come back when she's ready and stay longer." Wren looked at him. "This is a large property," he said. "There's room." She understood that this was his way of saying several things at once, that whatever was here was intended to be permanent, that he was not planning for her to be temporary, that the calculations he had been making in his quiet interior way had arrived at a conclusion that had room in it for more than the two of them. He said it as a practical statement because that was the language he was most fluent in, but she had learned to hear the thing underneath the practical language, and what she heard was large and solid and real. "All right," she said. They went inside. It was Hadley Cross who resolved the final piece with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been dealing with difficult men in this valley for longer than most of them had been alive. She did not make a scene of it. She simply had a set of conversations, careful private, with the people who had confirmed the pattern in their own records, and those conversations had consequences the way Hadley's conversations tended to have consequences, and those consequences moved through the relevant channels without any particular fanfare. The supplier who had been skimming from ranches across the valley for 3 seasons left the area. Whether he left because he understood what was coming, or because Hadley had made it impossible for him to continue without scrutiny, Wren never determined precisely. It did not matter. The pattern was disrupted. The proof was on record. The people it had affected had found each other and found the language to talk about what had happened to them, which was its own form of resolution even before any formal accounting was made. The 2 men who had come to the gate did not return. The accusation that had followed Wren from the place she had left did not follow her any further. She was learning to be at peace with not knowing the full mechanism of how some things resolved. What mattered was that they had. The morning when she understood this fully was an ordinary morning. That was the thing about the important moments, they so rarely looked like what they were. She was at the desk with the ledger doing the weekly accounts, and she realized at some point that she had gone through the entire previous week without looking over her shoulder. Without the reflexive checking that had become so habitual, she had stopped noticing it the way a person stops noticing a sound that has been constant long enough. It was gone. Not the awareness of risk. She was not a woman who intended to stop being careful, but the specific, constant, low-level bracing for the blow that had been traveling toward her since the day she had walked into an office with a stack of documentation and said, "Here is what is true." She sat for a moment with the ledger open and the pen in her hand and let herself notice the absence of it. Let herself understand what it meant. Then she picked up the pen and went back to work. Colt came in mid-morning and went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee, which he set down on the desk beside her, not interrupting, just providing in the straightforward way he provided things. And then he looked at the ledger and said, "North pasture fence is holding." "I know," she said. "I watched you check it yesterday." He looked at her. "You were in the house." "The north window," she said. "I was watching." Something moved through his expression. He sat in the chair across from the desk, not the chair of a man sitting down for a formal conversation, but the chair of a man sitting in a room where a woman he trusted was working, because that was where he wanted to be. "Hadley came by while you were out yesterday," she said without looking up from the ledger. She said a 5th family confirmed the same pattern in their records. Does that change anything for us? It means the picture is complete enough to speak for itself without anyone having to speak for it. She looked up. That's what I needed. A truth that stands on its own legs without needing someone to hold it up. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the desk and the ledger and the pen in her hand, at the specific image of this woman doing this work at this desk, which had been. He suspected the image his mind returned to most often in all the hours he spent outside with his hands busy and his thoughts their own. When you came here, he said, I thought. He stopped, started again. The arrangement I had in my mind was practical, specific, a person to manage what I wasn't managing well so that I could do the work I actually knew how to do. That was all I wanted. I decided that was all there was room for. She set the pen down. She gave him her full attention, which was the thing he was asking for without asking. I was wrong about the room, he said. It turns out there's more of it than I built. She looked at him across the desk, this careful, solitary man who had ridden out into the country and come back, who had said the most honest things she had ever been told, and said them in the quietest voice, who had never once in all the weeks she had been here made her feel like a temporary thing. I know, she said. I've been noticing. And the word was careful. He was not a man who made himself vulnerable without cost, and she could hear the cost in the economy of that single syllable. She thought about what Iris had said on the porch, about things that needed to be said out loud before they could be fully accounted for. She thought about the difference between knowing something and letting it move from the part of you that observes into the part of you that chooses. And I came here with nothing, she said. A bag and a ticket that wasn't mine, and a skill that had cost me everything I'd tried to build with it. I came here expecting... She paused. I wasn't expecting anything, actually. That's the truth of it. I'd stopped expecting things because expecting things had proven to be expensive. She looked at him steadily. And then I got here and found a desk that needed work and a ledger that needed reading. And every day that has passed since the first one, something has been added. Small things. True things. The kind of things that don't announce themselves as mattering and then turn out to be the only things that do. He said nothing. He was listening the way he listened completely, without the fidgeting of someone waiting to respond. I don't know how to say this in a way that sounds like the things people say, she told him. I'm not sure I have the language for it. But what I know is that this is the first place I've been in a very long time where I can look at the full of what's around me and not find a reason to hold part of myself back. She held his gaze. I don't want to hold myself back anymore. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that was not the absence of response, but the presence of something being fully received. Then he stood. He came around the desk. He did not do anything dramatic. He was not a man for drama, which was one of the things she valued most about him. He simply stood beside her and placed his hand over hers on the desk, his rough, work-marked hand over her smaller, pen-calloused one, and stayed there. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while in the morning light of the room that had become her room at the desk, that had become her desk with the ledger open between them and the whole of the ranch going about its business outside the windows, and nothing was said because nothing needed to be. It was one of those moments that she knew even while it was happening that she would return to. Not because it was dramatic, it was not. There was no declaration, no ceremony, nothing that a person watching from outside would have marked as significant. Just two people and a ledger and a hand held in the morning light in a room that smelled of coffee and old wood and the particular dryness of open country in the season between seasons. But she had learned at some cost to recognize the weight of things, and this had weight. The kind that settled into a person and stayed. The kind that changed the shape of what came after without announcing that it was doing so. She thought about the woman who had stood at the edge of a dirt road with a ticket that bore someone else's name and looked at a gate and made a decision in the space of a breath. That woman had not known what she was walking toward. She had only known what she was walking away from, and that even walking away from something requires a direction, and the direction she had chosen had been this one for no better reason than that the ticket was available and the train was leaving, and she had nothing else. And yet, here she was, at a desk in a room with an east-facing window with a man's hand warm over hers and work she knew how to do waiting in the open pages of a ledger. Here she was, which was the strangest and most complete fact she could think of. Whatever else was uncertain, and much was still uncertain, she was not a woman who pretended otherwise. This was not. This was solid. This was real. She was here, and the here was hers. Later that day, she found Colt in the barn. She leaned on the stall rail beside him and watched him work. She had been thinking about something since the morning, turning it over. The way she turned figures over in her mind, looking for the logic of it, the sequence that made it readable. "The ledger cover," she said. "The one for next season. You put my name in it." He kept working. "It's your ledger. In your handwriting. Mine's the one that's here." He glanced at her sideways briefly. "Yours is better, but it wasn't available." She looked at the calf in the adjacent stall, grown now steadier on its legs than it had been in the lamplight of that first long night in the barn, which felt like it belonged to a different season of the story. She supposed it did. Everything that had happened between that night and this one had changed the terms of the story entirely, not by sudden reversal, but by the slow accumulation of small true things, which was how she was beginning to understand that real change happened. Not in dramatic breaks, but in the patient addition of evidence until the weight of it was undeniable. "Wren," she said, trying the sound of it in this space. Her name in this barn at this ranch, belonging to this life that had been assembled from a 5-minute decision and a ticket that was not hers. "That's your name," Colt said. "I know. I'm just—" She looked at him. "Making sure it fits." He set down what he was holding and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he reserved for things that mattered to him. "Does it—" She thought about steady hands and ledgers that told the truth, and a man who had ridden out and come back. She thought about a name that had been her own through everything, through the accusation and the departure, and the long road, and the gate with its iron hinges, and had arrived here intact, still, hers still true. "Yes," she said, "it fits." She thought about what that meant, a name fitting. She had always assumed that names simply were that they belonged to a person the way a date of birth belonged to them, a fixed fact established before they had any say in the matter. But standing here in this barn, in this valley, in this life that she had assembled from the materials available to her in the 5 minutes after Iris set a ticket on a table and walked away, she was beginning to understand that belonging was something you made, not something that was handed to you. The name fit because she had carried it into a place where it could be itself. Because she had stopped running and turned around and let the name mean what it meant, which was her. All of her, including the parts that had been used against her, and the parts that had been doubted, and the parts that had proved in the end to be exactly right. The evening came in the way evenings came, at broken spur, gradually, generously, the light taking its time, moving off the hills, and leaving them in the particular color of the hour before dark. She stood on the porch and watched it happen and felt, with the same precision she brought to anything she examined carefully, that this was real, that she was here, that the sequence of decisions, hers and his and Hadley's and even Iris's, in her imperfect, well-intentioned way, had produced something that she had not known how to want before she found it. There was a particular quality to this light. She had noticed the way it moved off the hills in a certain order, ridge by ridge, starting with the highest points and working its way down. She had been watching it for weeks now, and had come to understand that it never varied, that the hills gave up the day in the same sequence every evening, that this was one of those things in the world that could be relied upon absolutely. She had not known before coming here how much she needed such things. She had spent so long in circumstances that changed without warning, where reliability was something other people enjoyed, and she simply worked around its absence, that the steadiness of this place, its rhythms, its patterns, its refusal to surprise her about the fundamental things had been a kind of medicine she had not known she was taking. Until she noticed one day that she felt different than she had before. Colt came to stand beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking. He stood the way he always stood, present, without pressing there, without demanding anything from being there. She had come to know this quality of his as one of the most valuable things about him, though it had taken her a while to recognize it for what it was. She had spent years around people who filled every available space with themselves, their needs, their noise, their constant requiring of acknowledgement. Colt required nothing. He simply was solidly and reliably, and that solidity had a quality she was only beginning to have language for. After a while she said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I'm glad Iris left the ticket on the table," she said. "I've been trying to decide for weeks whether I was allowed to be glad about that, whether it was the kind of thing a person could feel without some obligation to feel complicated about it first." She looked at the hills. "I've decided I'm allowed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular economy of a man who had spent a long time alone, and had finally, at great personal cost, learned the value of saying the necessary thing, "So am I." The last light left the hills. The first stars arrived above the western ridge, tentative, then steady, then simply there, the way reliable things were simply there once a person had learned to look for them. The gate at the end of the road stood open. It had been standing open since morning. Colt had left it that way when Hadley came through, and neither of them had thought to close it. It stood there in the fading light, open at the end of the road that had brought Wren Calloway here, with a ticket that bore another woman's name, and a skill that had cost her everything she'd tried to build with it, and a capacity for steadiness under pressure that had turned out in the end to be exactly what this place needed. She looked at the open gate. Then she looked at the man beside her, and at the lit window behind them, and at the desk inside, where next season's ledger waited with her name written on the inside cover in handwriting that was not hers. She did not go and close the gate. She left it open the way a person leaves things open when they are no longer expecting something to come through them and are simply done finally with the habit of bracing. She stood there for a long moment and let herself understand what the open gate meant. It meant she was no longer preparing to leave. It meant she had stopped holding part of herself in reserve, that provisional withholding she had maintained for months, the part of her that had kept one foot pointed toward the door in case she needed to move quickly, in case the ground shifted, in case this turned out to be another place that could not be trusted. She had been doing this for so long that she had forgotten it was a choice. It had simply become the way she was in rooms, in houses, in relationships, always slightly poised for exit, always ready to discover that the thing she had allowed herself to want was about to be taken away. She was not poised for exit now. She was standing on a porch in the last light of day, next to a man who had ridden out and come back in a life that she had built from a 5-minute decision and a steady hand. And the gate was open behind her, not because she was considering leaving, but because she had simply stopped thinking about it. The wind moved through the grass in the long, patient voice of this country. And Broken Spur Ranch held the night at the distance it was supposed to be held, and Wren Calloway stood on the porch of the life she had not known she was coming to and breathed.